Welcome to my channel, where manga and anime stories come to life in audiobook form. Here you'll find manga-inspired adventures, anime-style fantasy, action-packed battles, dark mysteries, and emotional story arcs. From powerful heroes and crazy plot twists to supernatural worlds and unforgettable characters, there's always a new story waiting. If you've ever said just one more episode at 2 a.m., you'll fit right in. And don't forget to like and subscribe.
Professor Sinclair was sitting with his feet on the classroom desk. With his fingers interlocked behind his head, he quietly watched the last students hurriedly taking their seats. Once the door closed and the lights dimmed, Sinclair pressed a device held in his hand. On the screen, slides with questions written on them began to play one after another. Sinclair let out a deep sigh and pointed at the screen. Originally, today's class was supposed to be about our history. How numerous humanity was before the portals opened, how much territory we lost, meaning the red zone, stuff like that. He dropped the device he was holding onto the desk with a clatter, wearing a heavy expression. Instead of listing useless numbers, I'll tell you something that might actually be important. He crossed his arms, leaned forward, and looked straight at the students. Bastion. Anyone heard of it? His voice was calm, but Sal could feel the anger dwelling in his eyes. Several people raised their hands, and Sinclair nodded. When the world started collapsing and we were on the brink of being completely pushed back, something called the Bastion program was announced. It was a kind of exit ticket only for the super rich. Sinclair pointed upward with his finger. It meant shooting themselves into space to stay safe. He slammed his hand on the desk. Thud. People still make jokes like that these days, saying Bastion is ruling the earth. Since half of you seem to be hearing that name for the first time, its influence has almost disappeared, they say, but they're still threatening existences. Does anyone know why? One student cautiously raised a hand. Sinclair nodded and gestured for them to speak. Is it because there are people loyal to them here too? Sinclair smiled and waved his palm from side to side. Almost correct. The real reason Bastion is a threat to us is that they still control a majority of our media signals, and they're pushing their propaganda to the public. His gaze sharpened. Do you know what's even more serious? Most of the retrieval guilds we rely on right now are receiving funding from Bastion. Why is this dangerous? Another person raised a hand, and Sinclair induced an answer with a nod. Because retrieval guilds are only retrieving wealthy areas, not areas that would be helpful to refugees. Sinclair smiled at the student and nodded. Half correct. Do you know how much money is being spent to guard each of those grand mansions Bastion will use later? Empty mansions where no one knows who will return or when. He shook his head as if disappointed with those taking the class. The Prowler attack yesterday was an absolutely necessary lesson. You have grown up watching only media created by guys who don't even live on this land all your lives. Brainwashed with words of hope called salvation and a bright future. Is there any fan of valor here? Sal raised his hand. Looking around, almost everyone was raising their hands. The Veritas Guild and Guildmaster Valor were existences that accompanied their childhoods. He was known as a hero who executed monsters and protected the weak. But Sinclair didn't show any smile. Then, anyone who knew Valor wasn't a real person? Only a few raised their hands. Sal was surprised to see Divinity raising her hand. Sinclair pointed to her, and Divinity started explaining. The places shown on broadcast didn't match the registered safe zones, and the Veritas Guild wasn't registered with the United Guild Alliance. Sinclair nodded and passed the question to another student. It was broadcast that Valor executed a monster horde in our sector, but in reality, nothing like that happened. The place shown on broadcast was also an old appearance destroyed decades ago. Right? They're all fabricated videos. Sinclair shook his head in disgust. If you want to know about portals, monsters, dungeons, and towers, discard every concept you've known until now. He walked out in front of the desk, leaned on it, and continued. Now, let's start with portals. A portal is a hole suddenly pierced in the sky. It can appear anywhere, and is generally a door leading to another world. Sinclair's tone was somewhat sarcastic, yet serious. Then what about dungeons? A dungeon is the territory of powerful monsters, usually full of traps or various loot. Sometimes, the monster itself is the dungeon. But let's talk about that later. You must have heard the term dungeon portal. It means a portal that closes only when specific conditions are met. Usually, killing the monster is the condition. The tone was plain, but Sinclair increased his speed and continued listing information. What's left is the tower. He lifted his head and said, a tower is a structure where dungeons are stacked in layers. There is one monster on each floor, and you must defeat it to go up to the next floor. It's a structure favored by heroes or adventurers, but never underestimated. Sinclair leaned his body on the desk and lowered his voice. This introductory lecture is simple. You will learn the types of monsters you will encounter in each region, and learn how to deal with those monsters as a team. And at the end of the semester, the corners of his mouth curled up like a beast eyeing its prey. Sal immediately recalled the Prowler class yesterday and stiffened. You will clear one floor of a tower as a team. Without my help. If Sal could go back to the past, he would have gone back to the night before and slept first. No matter how effective premium coffee was, it was insufficient to follow Sinclair's class. After announcing the shocking content regarding the final exam, Sinclair poured out explanations about the characteristics, personalities, weaknesses, etc. of 20 most commonly encountered monster species. It was somewhat comforting that Sal wasn't the only one having a mental breakdown. Most students also had faces stricken with shock and fear. Especially the classification called high-rank monsters was unforgettable. Sinclair called them lords. The explanation was that they could take human form, could even speak, and above all, were cunning and dangerous. It's shocking that prowlers are only the second weakest grade. No matter how strong he became, let alone a lord, it seemed he wouldn't be able to properly defeat even a single prowler. Sal shook his head as he left the lecture room with his classmates. There was a short break until the next class, and Sal was calculating how much he could sleep if he sprinted back to his room. Sal! But Divinity stopped him. Her gaze was fixed on Sal's new shirt, and Sal intuitively knew Obama questions would pour out soon. Did you make this? Divinity admired, as if exhaling, and swept the silver mesh with her finger. Then she looked up at Sal's face and asked, Wow, but your condition right now is no joke? Did something happen? Like caring for an elderly person, Divinity linked arms with Sal and led him to a rest area with benches and lounge chairs nearby. Tell me everything. What is this shirt, its functions? Are those runes? How long did it take to make? Questions poured out, literally poured out simultaneously. Sal found it overwhelming even to just follow them all. The effect of the coffee was gradually disappearing too, and he was so tired he didn't know when he might collapse. Made it all night. Haven't decided on a name yet. Sal answered a few of her questions with difficulty. Learned engraving and runes too, and figured out how to combine them to complement each other with my eyes to make it. As Sal's words became twisted, Divinity's eyes narrowed. Sal thought it was because she didn't understand. This is for defense. Combined with blunt resistance, a counterattack effect also occurs. Sal tried to smile while focusing on the rune with his blurry mind. But he increasingly couldn't remember what roles the other runes played, and started feeling something was strange. This wasn't simple fatigue. Sal raised his head to ask her for help, and at that moment, saw Divinity's two eyes turning white. He thought he saw her grimace for a moment, and seeing her expression made Sal anxious. When he didn't know how much time had passed, Divinity blinked and looked at Sal. It was a sympathetic expression. You have to go to the workshop right now. I'll take notes for the next class. Don't worry, okay. Before moving, she scanned the shirt once more and shook her head. Let's go. I'll go with you. Sal nodded and got up. He didn't even have the energy to ask what she saw. The best he could do right now was just walk following her. As Sal walked between the benches crossing the workshop, a whistle sound rang out. From afar, Upgrade had her finger to her mouth, preparing to whistle once more. She was the first to notice Sal's new shirt. Soon, other regular crafters also all got up from their desks and flocked to see it up close. Divinity had already left for the next class, and Sal couldn't even remember what she had said to him. He almost passed his own desk. Upgrade grabbed his shoulder and stopped him. Shows that you pulled your first all-nighter. We can help Dash. Her words cut off midway. Staring piercingly at Sal's reinforced uniform, she traced the silver mesh with her fingertips and examined the engravings one by one. After a moment, she rubbed and examined Sal's shirt, turning it this way and that. Then her eyes went wide. Is this real? Francis. Rune expert Francis ran over with an excited face. Restoration work again? Upgrade took a step back and gestured as if pointing at Sal's uniform. I don't understand. These guys look like they're all working at once. Her gaze turned to Sal's face again. He had eyes that looked like he would collapse any moment. Upgrade frowned and shook her head. Wait, Francis. She blocked his hand, trying to look at the shirt more closely. Sal, take off the shirt. Sal tried, but his arms didn't listen at all. He looked down at his arms with a blank face. It was the first time his body didn't move this much due to fatigue. Upgrade spat out a curse and tried to help him take it off herself. The moment she grabbed the shirt, one of the runes flashed. Sal watched blankly as Upgrade was flung hard onto a bench by the recoil. The anger rising on her face was terrifying. Sorry. Sal fainted right there. That was a remnant. Upgrade emphasized again. Sal clutched the blanket covering him up to his chest tightly. Upgrade pointed to the crystal pendant hanging around her neck. I use this as an essence source. My internal essence alone can't power the suit. If I used it without a core, it would run for a moment. But eventually, a remnant state comes. That must not happen. Never push yourself to that extent. Although she didn't raise her voice, she ended her sentence with weight. Upgrade took a deep breath and started walking slowly around the workshop cafeteria, as if choosing appropriate expressions. You connected 5 runes. Did you even think about the essence consumption required to wear that? Of course you didn't, since you haven't learned it yet. Sal watched her quietly. He was sitting on a fluffy sofa, and on the table in front of him was a special coffee brewed by the workshop's alchemist barista. Every time he took a sip, the fog pressing down on his head disappeared. Realizing once again how stupid he had been, he replayed the scene of blowing Upgrade away over and over again. To Sal, who was blaming himself with his eyes closed, her voice was heard again. "Are you listening to me?" Upgrade's voice was still firm, but clearly contained a different emotion. When Sal raised his head, he saw her holding the shirt he made. "First, know the basic principles. It's prep week right now, and personal projects are permitted a month later at the earliest." Upgrade examined the shirt, turning it this way and that. "Even without appraisal ability, I recognized at a glance this is rare-grade equipment. For first work, it's nonsensical. Moreover, in just one day..." Upgrade trailed off, then carefully folded the shirt and looked at Sal. "Never experiment with equipment you made yourself on your own body in the future." "Okay." Only then did Sal realize what the emotion felt in her words was. "Worry." He quietly nodded and tried to apologize, but Upgrade raised her hand to stop him. "Crafters are like that. Don't drown in talent and die, because you have to pump out a few mythos-grade items before you die." With those words, Upgrade smiled and handed the shirt back. "You could sell this to upperclassmen with ample internal essence. Or maybe the guilds would be interested too. Want to put it on the credit market." Upgrade pointed to the coffee cup on the table. "Take that with you, and give me the blanket for a moment." Sal was flustered by the sudden request. The blanket was the only shield covering his upper body, as he was currently shirtless. Upgrade casually activated her suit and said, "Who do you think took off your shirt for you?" Sal immediately handed the blanket to Upgrade. Upgrade's mechanical arms started moving busily. "I'm not a tailor, but you should be able to wear it for about a day." Sal watched her hand movements blankly. The actions of cutting, connecting, rotating, and trimming the fabric happened in the blink of an eye. After a few stitches were finished, she threw the completed clothes to Sal. In Sal's eyes, it appeared as a common grade item, but the durability had definitely increased thanks to Upgrade's skill. The moment he pulled the shirt over his head to wear it, Upgrade was already walking out towards the door. "Now follow me. Don't forget the coffee." Sal was surprised, touching the new shirt that fit his body perfectly. There was no trace anywhere that it used to be a blanket. It wouldn't look strange to other people either. "Can I dye it gray?" Sal thought for a moment, but soon shook out of his head, grabbed the rare-grade shirt and coffee cup, and followed Upgrade. As soon as they stepped out the door, he saw the relieved faces of his peers looking up from their workbenches. Only Francis still had a worried expression. Upgrade looked at him and shook her head. "No, Francis. Not today. Ask about runes later. He needs to see the core storage first right now." Francis slumped his shoulders as if dejected, and Upgrade took Sal to one of the closed spaces inside the workshop. When Upgrade placed her hand on one of the sensors, a huge automatic door opened. Cold air hit Sal, and he was genuinely grateful for the newly acquired shirt. "We maintain a low temperature to prevent essence from leaking from cores. This is our core storage. Renting costs Q credits, and we don't do outright sales. Usually, whatever a crafter makes, the core itself is often more valuable. This is yours." Upgrade stepped aside and pointed to the core Sal had restored a few days ago. "It's epic grade and absorbed essence from the air for a day at the top of the tower. Once charged, it will be able to hold quite a lot of essence. Maybe as much as the cores used during your skill registration." Upgrade laughed and gestured to other cores on the opposite side of the room. Unlike typical cores displayed in a circle on small stands carved from metal, the skill registration cores were fixed in steel frames and wrapped in complex wiring. This is set up like this to make it easy to plug into machines. They say repairing the core you burn out might take a bit longer. The principal said to leave it be until you qualify to repair it yourself. Upgrade said with a laugh, but Sal was confused whether she was serious or joking. He was at a level where he couldn't even touch machinery yet, since he wasn't even properly handling fabric and engraving tools. Sal sighed inwardly and drank another sip of coffee. Along with the warmth, he felt his head clearing. He looked at Upgrade and cautiously brought up a topic. "If you had my ability, what would you use it for?" He worried he might be comparing abilities, but Upgrade showed no sign of offense at all. "If I had that ability?" Upgrade was lost in thought for a moment, then answered. "If mythos crafting was possible, if I were first year, I would have made weapons. Unconditionally." She continued with a laugh. "Honestly speaking, throughout my time at the academy, I only thought about making things to make my life comfortable. But now I want to make things helpful to other people. What I've upgraded so far are essence collectors, barrier devices, train turrets. I've tried upgrading everything you might know." Upgrade said with a bright smile. Sal felt like it was the first time seeing her make such an expression. Can you imagine what a mythos-grade train turret would look like? How much efficiency would increase if you upgraded an essence collector? Maybe you could even make an unbreakable barrier? She shook her head and laughed. "Sounds cool, but considering the materials or time required, realistically it's absolutely unmanageable. Especially if it's a kid like you who can make weapons every guild would drool over." Sal's head was filled with possibilities he had never thought of until now. He had only pondered how to use this ability advantageously for himself. But this power held the potential to save countless lives beyond himself. But as he thought, he felt blocked. Sal placed his hand on the core in front of him. Even to the eye, it was full of essence. The core that was useless just a few days ago had now become an important resource. He realized the fact that although he restored the core merely to show off his skill, he was actually missing the core point. The silver shirt he held in his hand suddenly felt trivial, and he thought he had been using his ability in a completely wrong direction. Turning to upgrade, Sal handed over the shirt. "I'll sell this, and try to make something more useful with Q credits," like Upgrade said. Upgrade raised her eyebrows slightly as she accepted the shirt. Such a noble spirit at that age. Excellent thought. But one shirt won't change the world. Are you prepared for that much? She smiled, but her gaze seemed to challenge Sal. Sal had nothing more to think about. This was what he truly wanted to do. "Please teach me." Upgrade laughed and left the core storage, signaling Sal to follow with a hand gesture. After locking the door, she headed to another room at the end of the hallway. She looked back, picked up the coffee cup from Sal's hand, and placed it on a bench next to them. "No liquids allowed inside here." Upgrade explained just that much, opened the door, and entered. Inside was cold like before, but the interior was a completely different world. Blueprints filled the walls, and Sal's eyes reacted as if singing with joy as soon as he saw them. He didn't know where to look first, where to place his gaze. Then eventually his eyes stopped on Upgrade's smiling face. She spread her arms and pointed to the blueprint displays on all sides. "This is our design lab. Here, you'll learn how to draw proposals or blueprints directly with your own hands. All the noteworthy inventions of the past decades have blueprints here." Upgrade was excited like a person who had completely entered her own world. She walked straight to a specific shelf and felt each cylindrical storage container with her fingertips. Seeming to find what she wanted, she pulled one out and opened the lid. Sal watched as she carefully unrolled the blueprint and spread it on the desk. Upgrade pointed to various parts of the blueprint and explained with an excited voice, but Sal couldn't hear any sound. His eyes sparkled. Until now, his ability had always struggled to create answers with minimal information. But right now, Sal was happy enough to stop breathing. There were thousands of minute errors on the blueprint, and he instinctively knew how to correct them. Sal barely tore his gaze away and looked at Upgrade. She was smiling brightly, as if enjoying Sal's reaction. "First, the very first thing to learn is how to make a blueprint. High-quality blueprints can be resold to the school, or you can receive commissions to create them. But this one," Upgrade pointed to the blueprint that had captured Sal's gaze, "is a blueprint I made a few years ago. If I were you, this would have been the first thing I'd want to make. The material cost is absurd, and 90% had to be outsourced to other experts. But if successful, how many people could be saved? I come back every few months to look at it again, wondering if I can improve it, if I can change it to be even a little realistic." Sal's eyes turned to the blueprint again, and his heart started beating fast. His whole body was itching to modify and refine this blueprint, but he didn't touch it. He knew well that it was foolish to believe his ability would automatically solve every problem. Just looking at the single shirt that made him faint, the lesson that his ability wasn't perfect was sufficient. Sal deactivated his eye's power and looked at the blueprint as it was. Then he looked at Upgrade and smiled. "Now is the time to learn step by step, one by one. Can I make such a cool blueprint too?" Upgrade laughed, walked around the table, and stood next to Sal. She took out a tube of grid paper from under the desk and spread it over the existing blueprint, and Sal carefully flattened the paper over her drawing. Upgrade handed him a pencil and said, "It's an old-school method, but best for practice." Before Sal could say anything, Upgrade pressed a button attached to the side of the desk. Immediately, the desk's surface glowed brightly, revealing the original blueprint more clearly. A few seconds later, when a clear notification sound filled the space, Upgrade carefully pulled out the original blueprint that lay under the new paper and rolled it away toward the wall. Yet the lines of the drawing still floated on the desk. Sal opened his eyes wide. He lifted the new paper and realized the drawing was being projected from the desk surface. Upgrade pointed at the table, suppressing a laugh. Maybe not exactly a very old-school method. Still, with this method, you can test your ideas without ruining my blueprint." Sal chuckled and reactivated his eyes ability. Then the problems he saw in the original blueprint began to appear as they were. But Upgrade didn't just leave Sal alone. She pulled a chair over and sat next to him. "Theory is important, but doing it directly with your hands improves you faster. Let's do it together. I'll help you. But the first step of a blueprint is always the title." She tapped the top of the paper, and Sal leaned forward and wrote the title in his own handwriting. And below that, he wrote his name. Self-charging combat drone, Salvatore Argento. Divinity sat quietly with her hands on the table. She hesitated, biting her lip, looking down at her hands, then looking back at Sal. Since she had asked to talk before heading to the cafeteria, Sal gladly accepted the chance to converse with her. He also wanted to apologize about the incident involving the shirt. However, on one hand, the faces of students happily eating and wandering around the cafeteria kept catching his eye. Sal, I also know the shirt incident wasn't your fault. It was something that could happen to anyone, and the accident during skill registration was the same. Missing the combat class was unavoidable too. Divinity spoke carefully, pausing to breathe between sentences. Sal felt puzzled that she suddenly brought up the combat class, but he didn't interrupt Divinity. I also understand that you can't see the future, so I know it's unfair for me to get angry at you about things that haven't happened yet. Divinity frowned slightly and nodded, and Sal anticipated what would come next. But Sal received her word first and showed both palms, opening up space for her to speak. Divinity nodded quietly. Right, but your recent actions and the actions you will take in the future are not very helpful to the silver cohort. From the end of orientation, we will be evaluated more harshly not only as individuals, but also as teams. You are ranked second in our team. Now is the time to show a little responsibility. Sal found those words a bit funny. It was still the first week of admission, and it felt like she was already getting angry about a future that hadn't even happened. But he couldn't easily say she was wrong. It was she who helped him choose Purple Punch and the upgrade ability, and it was true that thanks to that, he gained the unique ability called Mythos Crafter. It was also Divinity who took him to the workshop to get that shirt off him. Without her, he might have been lying alone somewhere or carried to the ward. Recalling all that, Sal decided to willingly accept the criticism she threw at him. Divinity started pouring out words about the coming future with a trembling voice. As Sal maintained his silence, her anxiety grew more and more. Obsessed only with crafting, you start skipping classes. You don't even think about mingling with the silver cohort people. And even when going out for field practice, you skip it with special permission from upgrade or the principal. As the silver cohort barely passes crises, people start to dislike you. Divinity's voice grew louder, and tears welled up in the corners of her eyes. You don't come to class, don't submit assignments, yet you remain here. Countless people get expelled, but you survive without any effort. She trailed off, then dropped her head powerlessly. Eventually, even I come to dislike you. Sal exhaled slowly. Any remaining resentment evaporated at Divinity's last words. There was not a bit of hope left on her face, and Sal felt like whatever choice he made, he would eventually disappoint her. To be honest, if given the chance to skip combat or survival classes, he wanted to gladly take it. He didn't particularly feel affection for other students in the cohort either, since it was just a temporary class until the rank announcement at the end of the semester anyway. I'm sorry. Okay. Since coming here, you've continuously helped me and been a good friend. Just tell me how I can make up for it. I'll try my best. Sal spoke with a sincere voice, and he carefully chose his next words. Although the principal and upgrade had earnestly requested not to reveal the Mythos Crafter ability carelessly, he thought Divinity would have noticed. Actually, when I registered the upgrade skill, it wasn't like a super powerful upgrade skill was registered like I told you. Judging by her surprised expression, she hadn't noticed at all. I already had abilities to restore and appraise, but those skills combined with the upgrade skill to become the Mythos Crafter skill. It's an ability I made, and I can craft Mythos grade items. Divinity opened her eyes wide in shock and exclaimed, Mythos was you? Sal nodded, happy at the excited expression rising on her face. I guess in the future, I skipped classes because I was hanging out with Upgrade and the principal doing secret projects. Even now, actually, I'm doing a really cool project with Upgrade. Honestly, I want to keep doing that even if I skip all classes for the next month. Realizing what he said, even as he spoke, he hurriedly added, of course I'll skip classes as little as possible. I should try to be helpful in future assignments too. Thanks for telling me, Divinity. Sal glanced at the cafeteria visible behind Divinity's back, and Divinity laughed and waved her hand. You can go, but make sure to come back. Don't you ever get tired of eating steak? Divinity raised her eyebrows and asked. Besides, it's not even real meat. Do you really want to eat something artificially processed like that? Sal cut his plate and smiled happily. I never get tired of steak. And honestly, I don't know what real meat tastes like, but isn't this excellent? As if to emphasize his words, he took a big bite and made a satisfied groan, and Divinity genuinely shuddered. She had already finished her salad and was waiting patiently until Sal finished his meal. After Divinity quietly evaluated his eating habits for a few minutes, Sal's fork and knife finally rested on the plate. Sal wiped his mouth with a napkin and gestured with both hands. Can we talk now? Divinity nodded and leaned her upper body forward. When Sal returned with his food plate, she had firmly said, I can't concentrate while eating, so let's talk after you finish. So, about what you said, that I didn't help when my peers needed it, and disappointed the whole cohort. Sal straightened his back and started speaking. Divinity twisted her body slightly on the chair, showing signs of discomfort. She looked like she wanted to interrupt and apologize for what she said earlier any moment, but Sal raised his hand and smiled. I'm not upset at all. It's just, I feel like something is missing in your future vision. As Sal laughed defensively while raising his hand, Divinity raised her eyebrows but didn't interrupt. I believe the future you saw will definitely come. And I'm not trying to escape responsibility if my future self did something wrong. However, you said Hannah would be one of the top graduates, right? The kid who made that shield. I made equipment for her. And isn't it possible that she started standing out more in your future after that? Realization began to spread gradually across Divinity's face. The reason why her future vision suddenly changed was solved. Wait, so that's the result you created? Yeah, I made leather gloves and engraved Hannah's unique essence. Thanks to that, she can use more essence, and her recovery became faster too. Based on current stats and growth curve, it's quite a game changer. But will this be maintained for 6 months? I'm curious about that. Sal continued with an increasingly excited expression. What if we can pull up talents who originally wouldn't make it to the top ranks? I could make customized equipment to highlight their abilities. Divinity didn't stop him. If Sal was Mythos crafter anyway, him making equipment for someone in the future was a predetermined sequence. What if we can prevent someone's expulsion? You said it. Many good people were kicked out too. Then what if we know the future in advance and provide them with top-tier equipment? Sal smiled brighter, seeing her surprised expression. Flustering her like this was always exciting. There are 100 people in our cohort. Within that, there must surely be a perfect combination. A real team that can pass assignments easily and utilize each person's abilities to the max. What do you think? Divinity looked at Sal as if he were crazy, then said, So you're saying instead of forming a team with the best talents, you'll recruit the last place ones? Sal nodded as if it were obvious. We were essentially evaluated by a running race and a popularity vote. Why should over 1,000 people be lined up by just one physical ability? Hannah's shield could save countless lives, but her rank was in the lower end. I'd rather form a team with people who possess useful abilities than kids like me who luckily got high ranks. As Sal spoke his own thoughts, Divinity listened quietly and occasionally offered her own opinions. However, Sal's suggestion of using her ability on every student was immediately rejected, because the possibility of her becoming exhausted or collapsing was high. Instead, Divinity suggested glimpsing other possibilities in the future for students at risk of expulsion, but that also didn't guarantee giving them the necessary information. They left the cafeteria and continued talking while walking slowly along the circular auditorium around the tower. They exchanged various ideas for nearly an hour, but as the number of students became too large, realistic execution plans became increasingly difficult. Just then, when Divinity said, half-jokingly, "Shall we just storm into the registration office?" Sal suddenly stopped walking. A wide smile spread across his lips. Your ability. Can you teach me how to use it too? Sal sat with his legs crossed. The fatigue accumulated throughout the day had long been forgotten, and all his attention was focused on Divinity. Silently watching her explain the principles of her ability, Sal couldn't hide his surprise. In fact, he had withdrawn the request as soon as he first brought it up. He would talk about the limits of their ability in such detail, but Divinity rather excitedly continued her explanation, even confessing that she had wanted to do this together since she first learned of Sal's ability. The single condition she put forward was so sincere. She asked Sal to learn her ability and use it to prevent disasters. The moment he heard those words, Sal couldn't say anything. Divinity believed that Sal would be able to see much further into the future than she could, and thought if there was danger somewhere in the future she couldn't see, Sal might be able to stop it. Sal had heard her mention her ability a few times, but he had no idea how frequently she sent Portal Rift warning reports to the Academy. Learning what work she, already a hero, was doing for society, even at this moment, Sal felt humbled. She explained her ability in a way that was much easier to understand than Sal had expected. While most people use their abilities almost instinctively, like breathing, Divinity broke down her ability structurally one by one to teach him. Think of a big event as a reference point. Using that as a center, you examine the time frames around it. Like weaving a spider web. Yeah, exactly. At first, the stronger the event remains in memory, the better. You can't go far from the reference point, but movement in all directions is possible. She drew the structure of a web in the air with her finger, observing Sal's reaction. Remember what I told you before? About the Savior selection ceremony happening in a few months. I remember. How about setting that as the central axis of your future? Based on that, you can examine the surrounding time frames. However, the method to reach there requires a different approach. Sal nodded seriously. To use that ability properly, he had to understand exactly how it worked, and at the same time, he absolutely needed to know how not to lose control by getting lost in that power. Sal felt a bit of confidence in the fact that both he and Divinity possessed eye-based skills, but he instinctively knew that handling visions of the future would be much trickier than his own ability. Along with that, He had to recognize that what he was about to handle might be the highest version of divinity's ability. Sal tried his best not to think about what he might see, and instead focused on divinity's explanation. This time, think of a tree instead of spiderweb. Divinity's voice was calm, and she raised her hand, wiggling her fingers downward as she spoke. The past is the roots stretching deep underground. It consists of facts and events that have already happened. The trunk that grew above those roots is the present, and from their branches stretch out in all directions. Are those futures? Yeah, just keep going up and experience things that will happen in the future like the present. Is there a point where you're curious about what will happen? Then plant your own tree there, and imagine that tree growing toward the sky. Divinity moved her hand back to the imaginary tree between them. If you push the energy that makes the tree grow outward, you can create branches. But that's much harder, and you must know exactly what you want to see or know. As you follow that branch, you see new flows, new possibilities. However, the further away from the trunk, the weaker the branch gets, and eventually will break off. Such futures are even more fragile, so you shouldn't overdo it. She smiled again and returned to the other hand. So, we go back to the spiderweb. Once you find an event you want to know more about on a certain branch, imagine leaves or small twigs growing around it. Sounds difficult. Listen more. You set such events as reference points and create your own spiderweb. After gathering all information, you draw a single picture showing all possibilities around that event. Did you use your ability in this way? Yeah. As time passed, I became able to climb higher and spread wider too, but I'm curious in what way you will do it. There was clear excitement in Divinity's voice, and the moment she clapped her hands, Sal was startled, as if waking from hypnosis. Now it's your turn. Can you perhaps try replicating my skill as Knots? Was calling it Knots correct? Divinity suggested cautiously. She seemed worried that Sal might use his ability excessively and become exhausted, ruining the chance to see more futures. If we are at the same level, I can teach you from the basics while you use the power. If we do it near the circular auditorium here, previewing tomorrow's class should be easy, so shall we practice with that? Realizing the nuance of what she just said was strange, Divinity hurriedly corrected herself. Sorry, didn't mean it would be easy. I meant it could be good practice to start with. Sal nodded and activated his eyes. He exhaled slowly and looked at Divinity's ability. As streams of light became increasingly visible, Sal confessed his worry with a slightly blank voice. What you are about to see from now on is your ability. Remember, it's not my ability. He deliberately chose a timing when Divinity's reaction wouldn't be seen to say those words. As the streams of light shone brighter, at first he thought she had no reaction. However, a moment later, her voice was heard, and somehow it had an enjoyable tone. I wanted to see how amazing you could become. So don't hold back out of consideration for me, and go full power. A slight smile appeared on Sal's vacant expression. His eyes shone intensely. It was a sharp and deep light, as if piercing through Divinity. He suddenly stood up from his seat and began motions as if drawing something in the air by moving his fingers. Sal swore inwardly. Her skein had the most knots among all people Sal had scanned with his eyes so far. Seeing the future with threads twisted to this extent was close to a miracle. Sal tried to unravel the skeins, replicated with his ability one by one, but it was much more complex than expected. He reflexively raised his hands and started handling the threads. And surprisingly, as he moved his hands, the flow of threads became faster. Although he hadn't needed to use his hands when using abilities before, it was very natural despite being the first time. Sal began weaving his and Divinity's skeins with his eyes and hands. Distracted by untying the knots, he didn't even recognize the moment his hand touched Divinity's face. The moment his hand touched Divinity's cheek, she sucked in a breath. Divinity's eyes opened wide, and just as she opened her mouth to say something, Sal's hand was already withdrawn and stopped in midair, and he let out a sigh of relief. I think this is enough. Sal caught his breath and activated Divinity's ability. The silver skein Sal carefully wove occupied most of the space within the Mythos Crafter ability. It was floating inside his body, perfectly reinforced, and Sal checked the thread twice, thrice, preparing for any unforeseen situation. He intended to use full power this time, so he couldn't know exactly what would happen, but he was certain he had mastered the basics thanks to Divinity. As his power flowed along the skein, the thread began to stir as if alive. The skein started rotating around the halo of light at a speed Sal had never seen before, then soon vibrated. The light that was silver turned white. Divinity tried to say something, but before she could, Sal activated the ability. Sal's two eyes were dyed in pure white light, and wings of light soared from behind his back. The wings spread, cutting through the evening air, then quietly wrapped around his upper body as if embracing him. Under his skin, streams of light spread throughout his body as if holy essence was flowing along his veins. Watching that appearance, Divinity slumped to the floor tears flowing from her eyes. At that moment, Sal stretched his right hand forward and pointed at Divinity. Crack! Space tore at Sal's fingertips, and shapes began to reveal themselves one by one in the air. They were the appearances of Academy students. They moved very quickly, showing a continuous future. Sal shed tears as he watched numerous fates dotted with pain and destruction. Most of the futures were thoroughly crumbled. The further the future stretched, the more the end was only destruction. Thousands of branches broke off without reaching the sky. Without the reference point or context Divinity mentioned, he didn't even properly understand what he was seeing, but instinctively focused his gaze on the highest branches. Sal instinctively knew that those branches contained possibilities close to survival and victory. But the problem was, he couldn't know who the figures in that future were, nor when or where that was. Somewhere deep in his chest fluctuated rapidly. It was a warning that he didn't have much time left. The forest surrounding him began to collapse. Choosing instinct over reason, Sal started tracing down from the highest branch. The root was in the academy, and in the highest branch, a scene he couldn't understand flashed by. He approached the base of the branch. It was a fork close to the beginning, close to the center of the tree. This time it was a bit more familiar. There were faces he vaguely remembered. However, there was no time. The collapse of the forest caught up to him, and every moment he tried to remember crumbled down. As if struggling for the last time, he looked at the largest divergence point split from the trunk of the tree. That place was the starting point of the branch, and a turning point that made a future of survival possible beyond numerous destructions. At that moment, Sal's eyes grew large. Another scene flashed before his eyes. Sal collapsed forward as he deactivated his ability. Watching the vision seep into darkness and melting back into the present moment, he looked around with panicked eyes. His heart pounded wildly, and he turned his body to check around the circular auditorium. Laughter from a few passing students could be heard, but most didn't pay them much attention. Turning his head to find Divinity, he saw her kneeling beside him. Her eyes were still glowing white. It meant she was still looking into the future. Seeing her posture and his own lying position, Sal realized she had been cradling his head while he was unconscious. Let's not wake her forcibly. Now knowing what it felt like to be dragged out of vision by force, he didn't intend to wake her up forcefully. Instead, he struggled to organize the scenes he had seen. Most futures depended on variables he didn't know at all, and he finally understood the concept of reference points of memory divinity mentioned to the bone. He cursed himself inwardly for climbing too high up the branches. All those visions were blurring like dreams, and Sal tried to organize as many scenes as possible in his mind before forgetting them. But among all of them, one final scene remained clearly etched in his brain. It was the catalyst to avoid countless destructive outcomes and move toward the optimal branch of the future. "You're back. What did you ask?" Divinity's excited voice burst out, cutting through the surrounding noise. But the moment she saw Sal's pale and grim expression, her words stopped without finishing. She grabbed his arm firmly. Sal flinched reflexively at that touch and had to calm himself for a moment. It seemed he had never trembled this much in his life. He didn't even have the strength to support his body. "How long was I perhaps?" Sal placed his hand on the ground to steady himself. The world spun as if he were dead drunk, and with every word, he had to gasp for breath painfully. Sal blinked rapidly, gave up on continuing to speak, and focused on catching his breath instead. Divinity's voice rang much louder than he expected, and Sal staggered his upper body, trying not to lose consciousness. Eventually, as he had been doing all day, he cursed his own foolish choices. Useless fool, depleting all energy on equipment he made himself, and attempting Divinity's ability at maximum output within hours. Sal shook his head in annoyance at his own recklessness and endured the dizziness, shaking his senses with clenched teeth. He turned his head to look at Divinity. At that moment, the sound of her sharply inhaling breath sounded like a warning alarm in his head, and his last support crumbled. Cursing the darkness rushing in again, Sal fell into unconsciousness for what felt like the 1,000th time that day. What on earth was he appraising to pass out like that? As Sal began to regain consciousness, a clear, singing voice said with a laugh. Unfamiliar energy gently seeped into his mind, washing away the darkness, and senses slowly began to return. "Forget the credits. I much prefer Oracle owing me a debt." The singing tone continued, and finally, Sal regained enough strength to open his eyes. But it was completely different from the situation he expected. Sal was still lying in the circular auditorium, not the infirmary or his room, and several students were gathered around. Among them, the only face Sal knew was Divinity sitting beside him. She stared intently at his face, then smiled with relief when their eyes met. "You're back." She sighed and relaxed her shoulders. When Sal turned his head, another girl was smiling brightly on the opposite side. Her disheveled red hair was slowly floating due to the side effect of her ability, and her eyes shone with vivid green light. Sal felt more energy being injected into him, eliminating the remaining throbbing pain. Looking down, her palm was placed on his chest, and faint green light flowed from there, cleanly removing Sal's pain. Healer. Sal spat out, feeling no pain at all. That singing voice rang out again. She turned her head and spoke to Divinity, as if asking, "Yeah, how did he know?" Then she looked at Sal again, laughed mockingly, and lifted her hand to gently cup his chin. Just as Divinity was about to say something, strange energy wrapped around Sal's mind, and his eyes rolled back. Abilities like this need some recovery time, you know? You don't want to go blind, right? This time, a sharp energy carried in the singing voice. Sal felt his two eyes burning, but it wasn't a particularly unpleasant feeling. He tried to activate his eyes, but the pouring energy blocked even that. No, you shouldn't do that," she said with a laugh, turning her head to look at Divinity. "Since I just used more energy, the price went up a bit. Being rank 2, you must have received quite a bit of credits at the opening ceremony. You can spend that much for friend, right?" Her words were still like a song, but the tone was threatening like a predator. "He'll pay you back later, right, Mr. Appraiser?" As if emphasizing those words, the gift-like energy remaining in Sal's body was instantly detached and wavered, as if about to disappear without a trace. It seemed she intended to leave the recovered essence in a broken state. "So how about it? Want to make a deal?" The healer whispered softly, and laughter burst out among the students standing around. Divinity looked ready to accept any moment. Sal was furious at himself again for collapsing due to his own mistake and becoming a burden to Divinity. The moment the healer withdrew her ability, Sal immediately activated his eyes. His eyes burned with brilliant silver light. The healer, still with her back to Sal, believed she held control. Sal stared at her as if piercing through, replicating her ability at the fastest speed ever, not worrying about losing control or anything. He didn't intend to let Divinity be blackmailed and used like this. It was an act of resisting his own helpless existence rather than a sense of justice. As soon as replication was finished, Sal activated the healing ability, and soon the surrounding situation came into view. There were 7 students wrapped in light, and all of them were bound by threads of light connected to the healer. Sal moved his gaze to her arm, following the flow of essence flowing into him. She was holding that essence like a hostage. That energy wasn't hers, but essence stolen little by little from 3 students standing around her. Judging by their triumphant laughter, the 3 were definitely accomplices. Sal made a decision without hesitating for a single moment. First, he pulled essence through the connection link she made, getting a feel for how it moved and flowed. Fortunately, the healer didn't notice anything, but the thugs around her reacted. By the time Sal had accumulated enough energy in front of his eyes, the healer noticed something strange and turned her head towards Sal. "Hey, what are you doing, right dash?" Before she could finish her sentence, Sal extracted all the energy gathered from her gang and floated into his own body, using her as a medium. She let out a short scream and tried to remove her palm, but it was already too late. Energy began flowing in along her arm, delivered straight to Sal through the connection link she made. The result was immediate. Sal felt vitality and vigor he had never felt before filling his body. All sorts of pain and fatigue accumulated over the past few days disappeared in an instant. And what was more surprising was that the healing energy roamed around his body, finding places to fix on its own. Thinking his eyes might really be damaged, as she said, Sal guided the energy to his head and couldn't help but be amazed that there actually was an injury needing healing there. "Ow!" the healer mumbled, staring as if her own arm had betrayed her. "You're not just a simple appraiser." Sal shrugged and stood up. "And you're not a good Samaritan either. Needless to say, I won't pay the price you suggested." He brushed off his clothes and extended a hand to Divinity, who was looking at him with a face still in disbelief. On the other hand, the healer turned her head to look at her group and snarled with a venomous voice, her singing tone nowhere to be found. "He says he can't pay." Her intention was clear, and only now did Sal fully realize the fact that the students around were truly her subordinates and essence sources. He admired that she had already set up such a business in the first week of the semester, but the biggest emotion was pity for her foolish judgment. When the group showed no movement, the healer turned back to them and shouted. But what she faced upon turning around were 3 students bending over, gasping for breath. "You sucked all the essence out of these kids, just for you to survive? What a dirty act." The only people who knew this statement was false were Sal and the healer in front of him. As soon as his words ended, angry groans flowed out from here and there in the group. Sal decided to go one step further to completely dismantle this gang. "Divinity, could you check if these guys lose their abilities completely if they keep hanging out with her?" He pointed at the panicked healer. She seemed to finally realize what trick Sal was using. Divinity shook her head from side to side, covering the corners of her mouth as if suppressing laughter, and closed her eyes with an expression as if looking into the future. One loses their ability, and another seems to die. Her clumsy acting and shocked tone were quite effective, and fear seeped into the faces of the group students. Be picky about your friends, Divinity added with a soft smile. Perhaps due to her earnest tone, one of them slowly raised their body and even nodded. Meanwhile, the healer hadn't said a word. Her green eyes were still shining, and anger dwelt in the gaze, piercingly glaring at Sal. Don't try to get essence supply again. It's already cut off. You won't get back the essence you used either. Sal pointed his finger at his own eyes toward her. The healer flinched, seeing his silver pupils turn green, perfectly mimicking her ability. The gang looked ready to confront the healer now. Sal and Divinity left the spot, leaving them behind. From behind, the healer's voice, excusing herself, gradually changed into a threatening tone, and when Divinity looked back, students were clutching their chests and collapsing on the ground again. The healer was glaring at them with eyes full of rage. Sal, I think we just made an enemy, Divinity whispered. Sal, barely registering her words, led her toward the administration office. There's a bigger problem than that. He sighed and shook his head. We have to go find the principal and tell him about the visions I saw with your ability. Divinity looked like she still had a ton of questions, but seeing Sal's expression, she paused for a moment. Is it very bad? She examined Sal's face carefully, trying to confirm if her prediction was right. Sal suddenly stopped and pointed beyond the giant towers. Through the gaps, a blue-tinged protective barrier was shimmering in the distance. That was the boundary protecting the city from the red zone. It collapses from there. Sal turned his body and pointed in another direction. Other barriers spread at different angles were visible in the distance. Next is there, and then there. Sal's voice trembled. Recalling the scene he saw in the vision, he continued. Eventually the city is invaded, and the academy and guilds are all destroyed.